Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, the video series where we discuss a specific faction and its underperforming, underwhelming, or underutilized lords, heroes, characters, units, and regiments of renown, and talk about what could be done to make them better, what could be done to make them more competitive in the multiplayer meta, what can make them more appealing. And in this week's video, we are going to be covering the Greenskins. Now, certainly I can already hear some collective sighs. Greenskins are in no need of buffs as a faction at the moment. They are probably one of, if not the strongest faction in the game. However, that doesn't mean there are not units that are underperforming. And just like I anticipate certain Greenskin units will get nerfs, I would also hope and expect that those underwhelming units also get buffs. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. What could potentially be improved on the Greenskin roster. And we're going to be kicking things off with an old face, a face that no doubt comes as no surprise here, and that is the Orc War Boss. And he was on this list the last time we did Fixing the Forgotten. He's on this list again, and that is because he kind of sucks. Where every other Greenskin Lord in the past patches got a massive increase in utility with better items, abilities, new mounts for the Shaman for the Goblin Shaman, for example, or otherwise getting abilities like the boss's loons for the Night Goblin War Boss. Of course, Skarsnik getting longer range on his wonderful AoE anti-large bonus, and other such itemizations changes. With all those perks, the Orc War Boss kind of got left behind. His only change was that he got AP eventually, something that, for example, the Night Goblin War Boss already gets on a Squig, which is a very cheap and efficient way to bring him. And he got Smash Him Faster, which replaced Stand Your Ground, so now he can buff AoE melee attack instead of buffing melee defense. A little orkier, but really nothing unique that makes him stand out from the crowd. Otherwise, he's the same old kind of loser character. Somebody you don't really have a reason to bring. If you want a Wyvern Lord, Azag is much better. If you want a cheap budget character, which is really what this guy's all about, then you're much better off relying on a Night Goblin War Boss. If you want a character sniper, well, the Greenskins don't really have the greatest options for that, but Grimgor is probably still better, though the Orc War Boss, I wouldn't really consider that to be necessarily the Greenskin forte. And of course, if you need some AoE buffs and a sturdy Lord, then you're far better off with Grom. Grom, of course, is a bit insane, probably a bit overpowered, but regardless, he's a way better utility Lord. So what could be done to help the War Boss? Well, one thing I would say is improve his sturdiness. At the moment, his sturdiness sits at a pansy 3300 HP, which is 300 more than a High Elf Princess. So a scrawny little elf is almost as tough as the Orc War Boss. Seems legit. That toughness 3 versus that toughness, I believe, was it 4 or 5 on tabletop, really did transfer very nicely here. So, yeah. Poor Orc War Boss. Not exactly the beefcake you'd expect, especially when you factor in that he doesn't have particularly good melee defense or armor. Kind of lackluster there. So, I think he could get a bit more HP, and that would be a good start. Otherwise, I could see him getting some items that would enhance his survivability. One could be something, and this would make him unique in being a survivable Wyvern mounted Lord. Currently, Azag's not really the tankiest of characters. A lot of times he's got to run away and just cast spells from a safe distance. He cannot commit to a fight. So if, for example, the War Boss had a Potion of Toughness, a throwback to the Warhammer 1 days when he was actually a competitive pick, that could help. Otherwise, perhaps give him something unique, something like healing mushrooms, or something that's very more orky. Something that would, perhaps something like healing mushrooms could work like a Potion of Koroi does for Techless. And it could give the Orc War Boss some much needed survivability and give him something unique going for him. At the moment, the only tanky Lord options Greenskins really are like Grom and I guess Grimgor. Everybody else is kind of flimsy, and this would give the Orc War Boss a little bit more of a defined niche in being mobile, good against single characters, and also having heals. Or, I should say decent. He's never going to be great against single characters, but at least decent. And that could perhaps replace, say, the Potion of Strength, so he doesn't become an insane gooner. Otherwise, I think he could get some single target buffs, some point and click, improve a unit over their abilities. Because at the moment, the Greenskins do have single target debuffs with Grimgor. They've got some AoE debuffs with, of course, the Tormentor Sword on the Night Goblin War Boss. You also have some decent damaging abilities. For example, the Goblin Goblin Great Shaman. I forget what the item's ability is called, but it's basically a Spirit Leech that increases the ability cooldowns. So you've got that as an item. And of course, you've got a boatload of AoE buffs. Azag is an AoE buff bot. You've got Grom, who's got insane, probably overpowered AoE buffs. And then, of course, you have that on the Black Orc Big Boss and units like that. So there's a lot of units that provide that buffage, but I could see the Orc War Boss, if he was especially tankier, he could also be providing some good single entity buffs, single target buffs, make a single unit perform way better. Turn them into the boss's boys or something, and may give them a massive spike to melee attack and say immunity psychology or something along those lines. I know immunity psychology has been the handout for Greenskins now, but could be a unique take for the Orc War Boss. Something to help him buff a single target a whole bunch instead of buffing multiple targets at once. Either way, it is all spitballing. Anything would really help the Orc War Boss at the moment. He's kind of just a bad character. Bad in general, and especially bad in context with the Greenskin roster, which is just insanely strong. Alongside him here, you have Grimgor, and Grimgor isn't actually bad in my opinion. He doesn't really need much of a buff. This is more a question of giving him a little bit more utility in the form of the Black Orc Big Bosses, Rabble Rouse. I don't see any reason why the biggest, meanest Black Orc of them all should not have the ability to give his nearby troops immunity psychology. I think that will be really thematic and make a lot of sense for Grimgor to have that, not just the Black Orc Big Boss. So that simple take there, nothing to say much really for it. I would expect him to pay for it, make his optional choice, maybe like on the Black Orc Big Boss. But yeah, that's all I really have to say there. And a similar simplistic take here on the Black Orc Big Boss. A lot of you guys are no doubt like, what the hell, why is this guy here? But he's insanely overpriced on foot, in my opinion. On foot, this guy costs 825 gold. For reference, a Chaos Exalted hero costs 600. And the two characters have almost the same stat line. Black Orc Big Boss is a little bit more AP, a little less non-AP, slightly higher charge bonus to immunity psychology, and he's got 55 melee attack and defense versus the 65-45 on the hero. So there's a little bit of a different split there. 10 more armor, 2 more leadership on the big boss. There's a few little perks he's got, but it is certainly not worth 225 or 30% more gold. It's really not worth it. So what I would suggest there is bring the Black Orc Big Boss's cost down. I think he could easily be or at least on foot, bring his cost down. I think he should be no more than a 750 gold character, perhaps even a 700 gold character. Up the cost of his boar to compensate, because on the boar he's pretty fairly priced. He does gain AP, he does gain some charge bonus. He's actually becomes more powerful than a Exalted hero does on a horse, so by quite a bit more. So I think it's more fair that his price is more fair there. But on foot, I don't think the Black Orc Big Boss should be worth more than, say, 700. Really, maybe 750 at most. But at 825, it is just egregiously overpriced. So you could easily give him minus 50 on foot, minus 75 on foot, maybe even a minus 125 on foot, and slap that cost onto the board. Which does move us to the sole infantry unit that made the cut here, and that is Savage Orcs. Savage Orcs at the moment, in a kind of an ugly spot. They once were pretty strong in the shock-heavy meta of Warhammer 1, where they could cleave aside squishy chaff infantry very quickly and then breach onto the back line. But nowadays, their physical resist was cut way back when. It went down from, I believe, 30% to 25%. And, of course, Warhammer 2 is much less about shock. The HP pools for most units did go up. And as such, units such as Savage Orcs lost a little bit of that edge they once had. As it stands, compared to, say, normal Orc boys, they aren't really that much of an improvement. And you pay close to 25% more. You're paying 100 gold more on for Savage Orcs than you pay for Orc boys, and you lose out on shields, so you're much more vulnerable to missiles, even before we factor in the lack of armor. You trade armor for physical resist, but they've got no shields, so they're very vulnerable to missiles there. They actually have a little less leadership, which is technically even out by frenzy, but obviously they're getting frenzy there, but they don't get any more melee attack than Orc boys do without frenzy, and of course lose frenzy very easily with just 58 leadership. Kind of a similar issue to the Beastmen, where their units have Primal Fury, but Primal Fury doesn't last very long because their units lose leadership so quickly. Very bad melee defense means they very quickly take damage in melee, even if they're fighting a favorable fight. They'll take a lot of hurt, and really their main benefit is high weapon strength for a 550 gold unit and fairly high charge bonus, or very high charge bonus for infantry. But ultimately that doesn't justify a 550 gold price point. I think this unit could be justified about 500 gold. Otherwise, I think some slight buffs to some of their stats would be worthwhile. They are pretty mobile. Perhaps boosting their leadership up to, say, 60, or maybe a tiny bit more would be a little bit of a help there. Maybe upping the non-AP damage on the weapon strength, though then you are risking getting it a little out of hand there. But perhaps some slight buffs to either charge bonus or weapon strength, just make it a little more shock heavy, could do the trick. Give them something to help them clean aside stage half. If they were able to one-shot, because at the moment, if you're on the charge, it still takes 2 shots to kill, say, a model for Skaven Slaves, or I believe Bretonnian Peasants. You're still not one-shotting those models, and that essentially means you're not really benefiting over, say, an Orc Boy, because an Orc Boy 2-shots those models, a Savage Orc 2-shots those models. So when you need to cleave stuff aside quickly, that's not a huge benefit. So if, for example, they got an extra 4 or 5 charge bonus, that would make a difference against units like Skinks, against units like Skaven Slaves, units that you need to clear aside quickly, they would suddenly do so an entire hit faster. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, it makes a difference in real games. It does have a serious impact. So that's my 2 cents there. I don't think Savage Orcs need too much. I think they could find themselves a niche, but either a small gold cost decrease or a slight increase in statage here would help. Moving on to the Soul Missile unit here, and that is Night Goblin Fanatics. Archers, of course. Yeah, Fanatics are overpowered at the moment, probably. It's kind of hard to... Well, they're definitely an insane ability. The Regiment Renown is definitely overpowered. Vanilla Fanatics route so easily that it's less so, but it's one of the primary reasons you don't see much elite infantry against the Greenskins nowadays. That said, folks, Night Goblin Archer Fanatics are kind of pointless. There's no real reason to use Fanatics on an Archer unit. You pay 75 more gold for them, and they don't really help. Pushing close to the front line to cast these guys is suicidal. Casting against cavalry isn't particularly useful. So unless your opponents breach your front line with infantry, which is unlikely because they probably didn't bring expensive infantry to break through your front line, those Fanatics are kind of useless. What could be done to change that, I think, is if Fanatics are nerfed, and I kind of expect they might be again, but if Fanatics got a nerf to damage output especially, or has some nerfs to just how easy they are to cast or something, giving them a bit of a snare would be nice. That would give, if you could then use the Fanatics on the Night Goblin Archers to, say, snare enemy cavalry or monsters that are trying to plow into your backline. Kind of give you a pseudo smoke bomb, except on a archer unit, so they can kind of defend themselves or defend other nearby units, and it would make them a little bit more survivable. Just let them buy a little bit more time there, because at the moment, Fanatics spinning loons on Night Goblin Archers is just kind of It's a 40 leadership unit. You don't really want them anywhere near the fight, so not really the ideal unit to be using Fanatics with. Moving on, we do have Savage Orc War Boys, and these guys are at the moment heavily outshone by their probably overpowered, not probably, they are overpowered for the cost, Orc War Boy comrades. So if we compare the statage here, I think it tells much of the story. For reference, both Savage Orc War Boys cost 100 more gold than Orc War Boys. Savage Orc War Boy Big Guns cost 150 more than Orc War Boy Big Guns. Both units lose out on armor, 30 armor in the Boar Boys situation, 50 armor in the case of the Orc War Boy Big Guns. And in exchange, they get a tiny bit of charge bonus. They, of course, do get Frenzy. And they do get a tiny bit, and they do get a tiny bit of more speed. So that's kind of it. Not exactly inspiring, not exactly something to write home about. Yeah. So if we compare, first we're going to do the Orc War Boys here. If we compare Orc War Boys, and I do think Orc War Boys are a little overpriced, or overpowered at the moment. Especially with the AoE buffs you get with Grom. And I think the 65 armor made much more sense back in the day. Before Grom came around and before the Black Orc Big Boss came into play, Greenskins really suffered a lack of effective utility and support characters. So their cavalry was always fighting on its own. Their only decent support character form really was Wurtzag, and Wurtzag is squishy, so you didn't really want him close to your cavalry. Now you've got Grom. You've got the Black Orc Big Boss, who can do massive buffs in an AoE to units like Orc War Boys. And that's kind of made him a little overpowered here. But especially because they got that armor buff to offset a lack of support, and that's the case for the Orc War Boy Big Guns as well. These units already traded well in an isolation, they just failed in a practical battle. Now, though, they've got the utility that they needed, but they've also gotten overtuned stats. Savage Orc War Boys, not so much. So, going over the comparison here, you can see Savage Orc War Boys have a little more speed, a little more melee attack, a bit more charge bonus. but they have the same weapon strength. And keep in mind, there is a bit extra difference here in the sense that these guys get frenzy. So in a real battle, we can actually start battle here and see these guys do have a bit more killing power. However, they have much less melee defense. And keep in mind, these units cannot cycle charge very well. They're both very slow. So the fact that you have less melee defense means you will take a lot more damage. They also do not have shields. So if they're dealing with skirmish cav or enemy skirmishers, which you often are as Greenskins, they will take much more damage. They have no shields and they've got less armor. So while they do have that physical resist, they're going to be taking probably more damage than Orc War Boys. Orc War Boys against non-AP projectiles are immediately getting that 30% shield, and then on top of that, negating 45% of the damage. In comparison, Savage Orc War Boys are negating about 25% or so of the damage with armor, and then 25% with physical resist. So you're really looking at approximately a 40%, 40 to a comparable mitigation to the armor, but you're losing out on the shield, so it's a massive difference against skirmishers. And yeah, your main benefit is a tiny bit more speed that doesn't make enough of a difference, and then higher offensive stats. You charge a bit better, you've got a bit better weapon strength, and somewhat higher, and you do have higher melee attack. However, once again, with orcs nowadays, there's a lot of blobbery going on. You get Bob in there, you get the Black Orc Big Boss, and so these low stats are often just off, or not the Black Orc Big Boss, you get the Grom in there, and suddenly those low stats are no longer as much of an issue. And as a result, Orc War Boys are kind of better. So what I think, Savage Orc War Boys could use a price cut. I think at their current state, they could lose 50 gold and they'd be in a much stronger position. Otherwise, they could be given something a little bit more unique. Perhaps make them anti-large, or perhaps give them a bonus versus infantry. Give them some unique niche where they can really shine and outperform Orc War Boys, and leave Orc War Boys as a more universal unit. Similar case in the Orc War Boy versus Savage Orc War Boy Big Gun situation. Once again, you've got that gap in their melee attack, and it's pretty massive. It's rather monstrous, but you are, once again, losing out on a massive chunk of armor. Orc War Boy Big Guns, on average, mitigating about 60% damage versus the 45% on Savage Orc War Boys. And that's a big difference. That can do a lot. And of course, these guys are more expensive. They do have more charge bonus, but do keep in mind these guys do not have as much bonus versus large. You only got 5 bonus versus large versus the Orc War Boy Big Guns, who actually get a bonus versus large of 12. So really you're looking at 34 melee attack versus large versus 41. So it's not as big of a difference as you would think. Mostly you're bringing these guys to counter large in both cases. So in practical performance, Orc War Boy Big Guns are hitting much harder. They've got 12. They've got 4 more weapons, or they've got They do have a bit more weapon strength, not much. They've got 44 weapon strength versus without frenzy versus the 43 on Savage Orc War Boy Big Guns, but they are cheaper once again. And keep in mind, you're also bringing these units against factions that tend to bring a lot of non-AP cap. So factions like High Elves, factions like Empire, and maybe even factions like Bretonnian. In those cases, the lack of armor on a unit like Savage Orc War Boy Big Guns hurts a lot more than the lack of physical resist. Because Knights of the Blazing Sun will do a much bigger number on these guys. Knights of the Realm, much bigger number on these guys. And Silver Helms will do much better against these guys, because they do not have that armor mitigation, whereas Brigands do. So something to keep in mind there, guys. And there's 150 gold price difference between these two, and their performance against the most important targets they face is similar. Also, keep in mind, these stats are prompted by Frenzy, and you lose Frenzy pretty easily when you've only got 68 leadership. You lose Frenzy, and suddenly this melee attack's only 28, and that weapon strength goes down as well. You're not hitting anywhere near as hard, and your charge bonus goes down. So suddenly your stats are basically just worse, except for melee attack, and I guess weapon strength a tiny bit, but like your stats are significant in practice against large, significantly worse than Orc War Boy Big Guns in practical situations. So I think, once again, a price cut could work for these guys. Another 50 gold shaved off could be nice. Otherwise, giving them a slightly bigger bonus versus large would be, I think, not a bad choice. Or just separating Savage Orcs and making them like an anti-infantry thing. Or making them the anti-large specialists, while normal Orcs are the anti-infantry specialists. Make or Big Guns anti-infantry. Something like that, I think, would help give more definition here, rather than just 2 redundant units with quite a lot of overlap. The fact that all these units are very slow and can't really cycle charge effectively, is definitely one of those sort of hindering factors. That if these guys were a bit faster, maybe that's another option. You could give Savage Orc Boar Big Guns a little more speed and Savage Orc Boar Boys. Like if they got an extra 6 speed on each unit, suddenly I think you could make an argument that they can cycle charge all right, and you'd have more utility out of that charge bonus. So perhaps something like that is the way to go. But I do think they need a little something to give them oomph. Even if Orc War Big Guns, hopefully, in my opinion, get nerfs. Even if these guys get like a reversion on at least some of the armor buff, like -10 armor, or -10 -20 armor, something like that. They'll still be better than the Orc War Boys are, or Savage Orcs are right now. So I would like to see them get a slight buff there. Moving on from there to probably the worst chariot in the entire game, and that is, of course, the Orc Boar Chariot. Sitting at a wonderful 900 gold. Very expensive for a very terrible unit. Only 40 weapon strength. Does have some bonus for infantry there. High charge bonus, but very low speed. Chariots, of course, kind of got shafted with the knockback changes. Low armor, fairly low HP, which is kind of surprising given that it's an orc unit. You'd think that if these guys have anything, it's going to be armor or HP, and they don't even have that going for them. So kind of a sad all-around unit. There's a reason you basically never see them. You never did see them. You definitely don't see them now. Yeah, they make you cry big tears. So what can be done to buff them? Well, you can make them even cheaper. Of course, it's part of the issue with chariots right now for all the orc chariots is that loons are just so good. But even if loons were not that good, Orc War Chariots would still not be picked. You'd still run the wonderful death roll equipped or pump wagon, or maybe just normal pump wagons instead of these guys. They're just not too expensive and too inefficient. So I could see these guys getting a little bit more armor. I think that wouldn't be a bad move. Otherwise, a little bit more weapon strength. They're orcs, they should hit hard. I don't necessarily mind that they're slow. Orcs are slow and clumsy, but give them like 50 weapon strength, and suddenly you're talking a significant boost in damage output. They'll still be a bit flimsy with kind of bad combat stats and bad armor, but at least they'll hit like trucks. I could see something like that being given to Orc Boar Chariots. Either buff their raw damage output, make them orkier, or boost their HP pool. I could see these guys easily having a 5,000 point HP pool, and that makes it a kind of annoying chariot to shut down, because it's a lot of damage you got to pump into one unit that's not that expensive at 900 gold. But yeah, definitely not a great unit there. Moving on to Squig Herd, my main gripe with these guys is just how vulnerable they are to getting rampaged and suicided. Once again, I think they do suffer from orcs just loonies countering infantry so hard, and countering infantry so hard. Although infantry isn't that popular, and Squigs specialize against it. But I do think Squigs could still use a tiny bit of a buff. I think a little bit more HP would not be unwarranted. Help them be a little bit more resistant to early rampaging. Maybe giving them a bit more leadership. They start at a base of only 36 leadership, so even with the Squigs Go Wild, they've only set at 48 leadership. They got immune psychology, but they're very, very easy to rout and very easy to chase off the field. So if they did have a little bit more leadership, or a little bit more speed, or just to get into combat faster, a little bit more HP to survive, any one of several minor buffs, I could see making the Squig Herd a bit more useful. I don't think the unit's too far away from being, say, Razorgore tier of useful. Razorgores are actually pretty damn solid, but so maybe you don't want them that good, but I think they're pretty close to being competitive with that. So hopefully we can see the Squig Herd get some mild buffs in that department. And finally, we do have River Trolls, and River Trolls kind of suck. On paper, they're trolls with a bit more melee defense, and a unique, and in exchange for weapon strength. And their perk is, well, they get aquatic, which great. And they also do get Overwhelming Odor. The problem is that Overwhelming Odor is also found on Troll Hags, who you find in almost all Greenskin builds nowadays, or certainly feels that way. So kind of a redundant ability. Definitely not that useful. Greenskins also tend to have pretty bad melee defense, so reducing that melee, while it kind of does synergize with the River Troll's high melee defense, it doesn't help other Greenskin units that much, because their melee defense is just so bad that buffing their survivability a tiny bit doesn't help that much. And you are paying more for these guys than you do for normal trolls. So as it stands, I could see them getting cut down to troll cost to make them a 800 gold unit, or preferably made a bit more unique, make them stand out. Poison, of course, is already applied to the Regiment Renown, so perhaps that's not ideal to make them directly compete. But I could see them getting some other alternate items. One that I've seen proposed and that I think would be cool is to give them some sort of vomit ability. Not necessarily like Throg's Troll Vomit, but perhaps just a short-range attack, sort of like Sepulchral Stalkers, especially old-school Sepulchral Stalkers, where you have like 1 to 2 shots of ammo on it, and you can use it before an engagement. Make them essentially monstrous infantry with blasting charges. And I could see that being, or kind of like a monstrous Iron Drake unit that's melee-oriented. And I could see that being a bit of a fun niche for river trolls. They can throw out, spew some vomit, melt an infantry unit at least somewhat. Maybe you could apply poison with the vomit, and that close the gap for melee. And that would make for an interesting, in my opinion at least, take on river trolls, with perhaps some price adjustments as needed. But personally, I don't like the idea of just making them trolls side graded, which is what would happen if they go down to 800 gold. I feel that they'll just be, it just emphasizes the fact that they're not really any unique or any better than trolls. So I'd like to see them made a little bit more of a standout, sort of the way stone trolls are. Because at the moment, the only thing that stands out about these guys is appearance, which is pretty awesome, but it doesn't offset the bad performance or lackluster performance. So that's my 2 cents there on river trolls. That is it for Greenskins. I think Greenskins overall as a roster are of course insane at the moment. They're very, very powerful, but there are several units, as we discussed here, that I think are just not that good. I'm sure there's some units some people might think are also not great that I missed out on. Certainly let me know down in the comments below what you think could have been included on here. One I was a bit tempted by was some Snotling Pump Wagon variants, but I feel those are overshadowed at the moment by the power of loons. So it's one where I'm hesitant to include it here. I don't want to include a unit just because it's overshadowed by something that's overpowered at the moment. So that's just my 2 cents there. Hopefully you guys did enjoy. As always, leave your thoughts, opinions, comments, and critiques down below. I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.